Mr. Donalds from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for coming out today. Really appreciate it. Mr. Edlow, real quick, it was said in previous testimony that roughly 3% of people who apply through the legal process of coming into the United States through the green card program, 3% of all that apply actually get approved. Can you speak to why that is the number? Is that accurate? Is that an accurate description?
I've not heard that number, so I don't want to talk about the percentage itself. I can tell you, Congressman, there are close to 1 million people that get green cards every year through the various pathways in, plus all the people that come in, have applied for asylum or have gotten in through refugee status and then ultimately became permanent residents, green card holders at that point too. So listen, there is a robust process by which people are becoming green card holders every single year.
So there is a robust process upon which people are coming into the United States.
Yes.
Mr. Beer, I saw you over there, heard your testimony over there. Do you agree with that statement?
Oh, absolutely not. If you compare the United States to other countries, it would take about 70 million people showing up in the United States tomorrow to get our immigrant share of our population to equal what we see in Australia, 35 million to get to where it is in Canada.
Mr.
The United
Beer,
States is an outlier for having a restrictive immigration policy.
Mr. Beer, do you think it is appropriate for the American government to model that of Australia and other countries around the world?
I think we should do what's in our best interest, and I think immigration can benefit the United States if done legally in an orderly manner.
Mr. Beer, do you think it's in the nation's best interest to have a massively open southern border that is largely controlled by the drug cartels?
Absolutely not.
So, Mr. Beer, follow-up question to that. Do you think it is wise for the Biden administration to reverse its protocols at the southern border?
Its own protocols?
Yes.
I don't understand.
Why
would it reverse its own protocols?
Well, let's go back. You just said that the current situation at the southern border is not in the nation's interest. It is not wise for the nation to have that.
Yeah.
And since the basic predicate of this hearing, by any objective measure, is that the policy prescriptions by Joe Biden since he became president has led to a massively open southern border, do you believe it's in the nation's interest for President Biden to reverse course on his policy prescriptions when he became president on January 20th, 2021?
I don't agree with the premise. His policies didn't cause this.
So his policies have not allowed for 3 million entrants into the country through wide open asylum and association from detention?
Sure, people definitely came. I don't dispute the numbers.
Do you deny
Biden's policies didn't
Do you
cause
deny
it to
the
happen.
fact that the drug cartels are going to make $12 billion a year trafficking people into the United States?
We should defund the cartels by letting people come to this country legally. Then they wouldn't have to hire a cartel member.
Mr. Beer, how would they cross the southern border, which is largely controlled by the drug cartels on the Mexican side of the border?
Would get on a
how would they
plane.
trespass that?
They would get a visa and get on a plane.
So what you're advocating for is that the policy of the United States of America is that people can basically hop an airliner and come to the United States of their own volition and free will?
If they get vetted by the U.S. State Department, what's wrong with that?
Do you believe the U.S. State Department has the capability of vetting that many people?
Absolutely. All legal immigrants are paying fees in order to get vetted. They want to be vetted.
Mr.
They're
Beer,
desperate to get
we are
time
talking
to
about the
apply to
same
become
State
legal.
Department under Tony Blinken that couldn't evacuate 10,000 Americans from Afghanistan, that couldn't evacuate Americans out of Israel, where you had members of Congress go over to Israel to get 246 Americans out because the State Department was busy sending text messages and dropping voicemails into people's cell phones. That U.S. State Department can process millions of people coming into the United States.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the State Department has its challenges, but if you look at where it started at 83% visas being cut by the last administration, I mean, they gutted the State Department's visa processing, which is why they were not able to get Afghans out of Afghanistan.
Mr. B, I have a final question for you. We'll leave Afghanistan for another day. I disagree with you, but we'll leave that. I have a separate question for you. Do you believe the United States' current policy with respect to work authorizations, Medicare, essentially public charge doctrine with Joe Biden's administration changed from the Trump administration? Do you believe that would only juice immigration into the United States if people coming to apply for asylum directly through the U.S. State Department? That it would only increase the influx of people because they would be able to take advantage of the vast amount of the welfare state in the United States of America? Do you think it would bring more immigrants or less immigrants?
Look, I don't support immigrants being on welfare. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. I think the city of New York has unfortunately decided to put everyone up in a hotel room and make their taxpayers pay for it. That's a bad choice for them. That's not the federal government has a limited role in deciding what New York State's or New York City's policies are.
So real quick question, sorry, Chairman, real quick question, quick follow-up to that. And I'll ask all three of you, actually. If you're gonna have open borders, can you have a welfare state at the same time? Mr. Redlow?
No.
Mr. Holman?
No.
Mr. Beer?
It's got to be restricted, and it is. Our legal immigration system restricts benefits to new legal permanent residents for 5 years.
Mr. Beer, I would strongly disagree with you because people are getting a lot of benefits the second they come into the United States of America, and it is wrong. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Sessions from Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Interesting dialogue here. The bottom line is that we're trying to get to the point where we understand legality and who is going to be a citizen. I would hope that the gentleman from California would not think that we were against his family voting if they were citizens, to be counted if they were citizens. But it would be less than, I would be less than candor if I didn't say, I believe that what's happening today comes a lot from taking advantage of this politically to bring 10 or 20 million people into this country, to move them to areas that American citizens have moved away from because their onerous way in which they legislate and tax and diminish those boundaries in political divisions such as New York and other places, and to crowd 20 million people into these areas just for the purpose of politics as opposed to the rule of law is, I think, really what this point's about. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the remaining time I have to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds.
I want to thank my colleague from Texas. I think that this debate is moving into an area typically where congressional debate goes into. Let's be very clear about what the bill does. For the 5th time, the count of people in the country would still occur, whether you're on a green card status or whatever the status are, or either if you have no status. But for the purposes of apportioning congressional districts, non-citizens would not apply to forming congressional districts. Not the count, not getting the numbers in various jurisdictions that deal with grant programs, funding programs, et cetera, that come from the federal government or to help states plan accordingly for state budgets or localities planning for local budgets. That would not change. In the United States, we have no ability to force people to fill out the census. Like I said earlier, we don't have that ability. People fill it out because they choose to. Now, of course, we do ads during the Super Bowl and sporting events every single 10 years because we want people to fill out the census, but there are citizens who don't fill it out. You should not, it is unwise to count people for the purposes of setting representative districts in the House of Representatives who do not have the capability to vote because they are not citizens of the country. That doesn't mean you don't count them for all the various things. To a secondary point, it is actually the Republican Party that has always wanted to have legal immigration. What we don't want, and I find it interesting, I have to make this comment constantly, but I will, and that's fine. What we do not want is what the President of the United States has foisted on the American people during his presidency. Right now, Joe Biden. This is what we don't want because it is damaging, frankly, inner city communities more than any other portion of the country. And based upon the current makeup of Congress, most inner cities are not represented by Republicans. They are represented by Democrats. And that is where the vast majority of the issues set around funding not being able to now meet the need because of massive illegal immigration by ignorance of the law of the President of the United States. Last thing I will say. With respect to what President Lincoln might have wanted, with respect to allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections, it's okay to disagree with a former Republican president. I disagree with that with President Lincoln. I do not think that is wise. I think that the only people who should be able to make political decisions within the framework of a representative government are the citizens of that government, of that nation.
Well,
I don't vote in Mexico if I was going to be in Mexico. I don't vote in Spain if I was going to be in Spain. And they wouldn't want me to vote there because I'm not a citizen of those countries. That is not xenophobia. That's common sense.
May I ask a
And what
question
has
with remaining
happened,
time?
oh no, I yielded before, I'm not yielding now, but thank you. What has happened to the debate around immigration, border security, around now apportionment and the census, is that if you have a legitimate point about how the business of the United States should run that is different from the current Democrat Party's vote, you are now xenophobic and don't care about immigrants. That is a lie. Let me also say, I would add that my current colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they have forgotten what their party actually used to stand for when it came to illegal immigration and immigration writ large. Because they actually did believe in secure borders and only a legal process and not massive amounts of illegal immigration. And that has changed fundamentally from where the Democratic Party was even 2 decades ago.
Will the gentleman yield?
With that, well, my time's up. I can't yield anymore. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Donalds from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, thanks for being here. Listen, I support the FDA's efforts to reduce youth smoking rates under their current authority granted by Congress. However, I do not support the unnecessary and unfounded regulations like the FDA's proposed tobacco product standard for characterizing flavors in cigars rule, which is purely based on, frankly, in my view, far more politics than science. What are some of the examples of the unintended consequences that might arise out of this rule?
Langworthy, Luna.
Well, first, the intended consequences would be a reduction in death rates, which is a pretty important one in my view. In terms of unintended consequences, there is always going to be some illicit market when rules like this are put into effect.
So then do you think it's wise for the FDA to proceed?
I think it's very wise to reduce the death rates in
But you also,
populations
but
concerned.
Commissioner, you did also acknowledge, and we're seeing it frankly in a lot of markets associated with smoking, but right now we're focused on flavored cigars. So it is, your contention is that it is okay to put in this rule around flavors in premium cigars because you have adults who are choosing to smoke flavored premium cigars.
Now, if you want to talk about flavored cigars, I would just say youth right now are smoking cigars more than they're smoking cigarettes. Flavored cigars are highly attractive to youth, and so it's a major concern that we have. Premium cigars is a different issue. That's in the courts right now, so I can't comment on it.
All right, so secondarily, California enacted a flavor ban on all tobacco products at the end of 2022. California already suffers from the second highest rate of cigarette smuggling, where nearly 50% of all cigarettes used by consumers are purchased out of state. Further, in 2020, 1 in 6 cigarette packs in California were smuggled into the state from international markets. In which ways does an illicit tobacco market impact the United States of America?
You know, I just was out in California about 4 months ago, and I met with the public health department there. Their longevity is so much higher than the average of the United States, largely due to a reduction in things like the use of tobacco. They have very low rates of use of tobacco compared to the rest of the U.S. So I think overall it's a net positive.
But Commissioner, are we going to acknowledge the fact that, yes, there are black markets propping up in whether it's illicit cigarettes or, if we were to go back to the previous topic of premium cigars, in part because of the policies of the United States? Do we acknowledge that?
You know, as I've already discussed, I'm a cardiologist. I'm used to life and death. Almost everyone prefers to be alive. I would rather reduce total mortality and deal with the illicit market than to tolerate 460,000 Americans dying of tobacco-related illness per year,
But Commissioner,
which is what our current rate is, and that's lower from what it used to be.
But Commissioner,
I'm
we also
taking care of these
Commissioner,
people. When
we
you
also
see people dying,
Commissioner,
it's not good.
we also have to acknowledge the fact that you're not omnipotent. You can't control the actions of people. Do you truly believe that you have the ability to control the actions of Americans if they choose, adults now move away from children for a moment, adults, if they choose to smoke a cigar or if they choose to smoke a cigarette? And by the way, I don't agree with smoking cigarettes. Not a cigarette smoker. But at the same time, do we acknowledge the reality that when you put up these barriers, what you also do is create an illicit market for these products, which could be more harmful to the users that use them?
I would never pretend to be able to control the behavior of people, but imagine if we had taken that attitude When I started out as a cardiologist, the average patient I took care of was 50 years old, typically a man smoking cigarettes, dying at a rate of 30 out of every 100 people with a heart attack in the first 30 days. Now the typical patient with heart disease is in the 70s because the rates of use of tobacco drop so much, not because someone
Commissioner,
stood over everybody.
do you think that's because of informing the public, or do you think that's because of government regulation?
I think it's a combination of both of those.
Commissioner, I would argue it is far better to get people to change behavior by informing them of the consequences of said behavior, as opposed to putting up arbitrary rules from the FDA or anywhere else.
I like that in general, but this is a highly
That's not in
addictive-
general, Commissioner. That is a reality of the human condition.
When you're dealing with people suffering from addiction, nicotine is a terrible addiction, very difficult to beat.
Commissioner,
It's an entirely different issue.
we hadn't got to a conversation about addiction. We're just talking about FDA rules around, frankly, flavored cigars, and then also some of the California rules around cigarette bans.
Nicotine is a highly addictive substance, so we are talking
I'm well
about
aware.
addiction.
I'm well aware that it is, Commissioner. But again, I would argue that information and education is far better than regulation and elimination. I yield. Called the Next Generation Empowering America's Nuclear Energy. I submitted several questions to be answered at a later date. The NRC and FERC have both responded, but the DOE has not. Do you have a commitment? Are you going to commit to responding to my questions over the next 30 days?
I'm not sure about over the next 30 days, but definitely we will commit to responding to your questions. I know it's in a review process, but we're also happy to sit and with you in person and brief too on answers, but it is in a review process right now.
Madam Secretary, this was January. It is now May.
Yep.
You got 4 or 5 people sitting behind you. What other review processes do you need to answer just one member's
Believe it or not,
questions
it's
from
beyond
Congress?
them. It's
Oh, I know it's beyond them. Let's move on. Let's talk spent nuclear fuel.
Yeah.
We have roughly 88 metric tons of spent nuclear fuel. It's for the people watching this hearing, it's basically takes up the size of one Olympic pool. Many countries, including France, one of our great friends and partners around the globe, they have invested in recycling spent nuclear fuel now. And the amount of spent nuclear fuel we have in the United States, we could power the United States for roughly 400 years. Is the DOE actually going through and exploring recycling spent nuclear fuel rods instead of the constant conversation and dogma about nuclear waste that is present in the United States? Do you think recycling spent rods is actually in the nation's interest?
I do, and we are looking at that, and I'm excited that you're interested in it as well, because I think that's a program that we should continue to fund.
All right, so when you say interested, what does that mean?
It means we've got labs that are working on the research related to it. I know that we've funded a couple of companies as well that are also doing that. We think that it is an important aspect of how we deal with nuclear waste.
Okay. All right, good. I want to follow up with you on that because we should be using all that stuff at our disposal. I'm glad that my colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, spent time with you talking about modular reactors and microreactors, so I'm not going to go down that line. I think it's important for the American people to understand that the future of baseload power in the United States, from everything from AI, quantum, digital assets, to our current needs from an energy apparatus, we are going to need massive amounts of baseload power. And wouldn't you agree that solar panels and wind turbines are not going to be able to fulfill that need?
Well, if you add batteries, they become more baseload-like, but certainly I'm not saying that one has to be at the expense of another. I think both can happen.
Secretary, I think you would agree that battery technology really has not changed that much since the Duracell.
Oh,
and
it has,
capacity
sure,
hasn't
it
changed
really
that much.
has.
I
We
think
can
you
have
would
a
agree with that.
conversation about that. It
All right.
definitely has changed.
I want to go back to a colleague with the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, because he went down a line of questioning with you about the administration's pause on liquid natural gas. For decades, the Department of Energy's position on liquefied natural gas has been that it is safe, it is clean, and it is actually in the nation's interest for it to be procured and then also used in the United States and obviously transported and traded around the globe. In short, what has changed at the Department of Energy?
Yeah, the only thing that has changed is that the volumes that have increased so much, we need to take another look. It's not that the ones that have been approved are not in the nation's interest. They were and they are, and they're going to continue to operate. It's the question of how much more new expansion and what will be the impact in the United States. So if we export our natural gas, what does that do for, if we export, we produce right now about 100 BCF of natural gas, a little bit more. If we export the amount that's authorized currently, which is 48 BCF, that's about half. What does that do to prices at home? That's a question.
Let me ask you this question. Do you believe that just in basic supply and demand, that more supply on the market actually decreases prices? And wouldn't a decreased price actually be to the benefit of the public interest?
For sure it would be.
So then what are we talking about, Secretary?
So this is what we have to look at. So one of the questions that we are looking at. We also have to take a look at what it does for global supply, our allies, all of that.
And again, this is a good conversation, but you know, congressional hearings, our time's limited.
Yes, sir.
Considering what is happening right now in Ukraine, isn't it in the public's interest here in the United States to increase exports of liquefied natural gas to cut down the ability of the Russian regime to actually earn money in the open market?
We are exporting natural gas. We are not stopping that.
Hold on, Secretary, hold on a minute. I'm gonna reclaim my time because I got 18 seconds now. We're not in a debate. This is a hearing, but you have put a pause. And you're saying it's in the public interest, but you can't really identify what the public interest is because it's in the public's interest for prices to go down. It is in the American public interest to try to limit the ability of the Russian regime to earn more money on the open market with their resources. Wouldn't you agree with that?
The pause does not affect that. Everything is still going forward.
The price does affect their ability to earn money to wage war, Madam Secretary. You know that just like I do.
It does not right now. This pause is for a brief period of time to update a study. It doesn't
How long is the
affect
pause?
any of that. It will be finished.
I would argue, Madam Secretary, that the pause that you are doing is against the law because you have not finalized your parameters and what you're looking at. And any events of that being finalized, you do need to execute the permits that are waiting. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar from Texas.
Mr. Donalds is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Chopra, welcome back. Question. So the CFPB refers to buy now, pay later products as the pay in for, number 4, product in which consumers split a retail purchase, typically $50 to $1,000, into 4 equal interest-free installments, with the first installment, the down payment, due at checkout, and the remaining installments due in 2-week intervals. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, generally that's how the market is today.
Okay, so you would agree that buy now, pay later products have a separate and distinct characteristics from traditional credit cards?
Yeah, they actually are in many ways substitutes for it, but they have a different way people borrow and repay.
All right, so then why is CFPB starting to interpret credit card regulations to include buy now, pay later plans?
It's actually how Congress wrote it. So Congress, when they amended the Truth in Lending Act, they talked about the different devices and accounts that could be used to draw and create loans. So what we did was we got actually a lot of questions. What are the existing provisions that apply? So a lot of the things that apply to credit cards do not apply to them right now. But there was some pieces of it as it relates to billing statements, disputes, and errors that did apply, and we wanted to make sure that there was some consistency around that.
Wouldn't you agree that the primary thing that makes a credit card is interest, and that buy now, pay later agreements are interest-free?
Yeah, so the way the Card Act and the Truth in Lending Act, there's a separate part about finance charges. So finance charges is what often triggers how you have to show an annual percentage rate and other pieces. So it is true that not all aspects of the credit card framework do apply, but some do.
I would argue that without interest, none of the aspects of the credit card framework would apply.
Well, I think they don't have to disclose, for example, an interest rate. That's one part of it. But as it relates to bills and disputes, that's really common for lots of types of loans.
All right. A couple other things. For over 50 years, Congress, under both Democrats and Republicans, have determined that the best way to promote competition and consumer choice while also ensuring robust consumer protection is through disclosure-based laws and regulation. The CFPB has been initiating a series of blogs, circulars, advisory opinions, and rulemakings that appear designed to upend that disclosure-based approach to consumer protection, often by labeling lawful and fully disclosed bank fees as unfair or abusive. If consumers cannot be trusted to make their own decisions after receiving disclosures, do you favor government mandates about product features and fees?
Well, respectfully, disclosures are not the only things that are required. There are some things that have to be disclosed, but there are other prohibitions. So like I mentioned in my opening testimony, in some cases there are restrictions when it comes to data, permissible purposes, and you can't disclose that away. So we have tried our best to say, here is how existing law applies. Disclosures have their role, but I would argue in privacy notices, disclosures aren't enough. And you've passed a number of laws over the past 50 years that touch disclosure and non-disclosure.
Yeah, but we're not talking about privacy aspects. We're talking about fees and fee structure.
but
And CFPB has, hold on, Director Chopra. CFPB has been labeling different fees and fee structures as misleading, abusive, et cetera. In that vein, is the CFPB outside of the framework that has existed on Capitol Hill for 50 years around disclosure being the way that consumers are provided information?
So not at all. For example, Congress banned certain types of fees altogether.
Whoa, but real quick, to that, before you go, that's Congress banning the situation, not an agency making a promotional view of a situation that is lawful, correct?
So it is consistent what we have done with congressional prohibition. So what we have done on credit cards is exactly in line with the congressional prohibition on excessive or disproportionate fees.
Yeah, but you cannot take a congressional prohibition on something else.
No, but it's consistent.
Hold on, Director Chopra, and then label it as abusive on something that is allowed under federal law. Now you're picking and choosing.
No, I'm not. Everything we've done has been exactly and squarely with what the prohibitions that currently exist. Now, if there's a loophole that's in the regulations we inherited, and when we do a look back to determine whether it made sense, that is part of the process.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Director Chopra, for coming in. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsfield, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chairman, to the ranking member for holding this necessary hearing. We continue to see alarming increases in the frequency, sophistication, and reach of scams. Meanwhile,
Now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, who I have read is on the short list to be potentially the next Vice President of the United States. Mr. Donalds, from 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Regan, thank you for being here. Earlier this year, the D.C. Circuit, the D.C. District Court here actually invalidated EPA's designation that allowed the state of Florida to process Clean Water Act permit applications, a process that's been in place for the last 3 years. Our concern, obviously, in the Sunshine State is that EPA agreed to essentially give us primacy in going through that permit process as opposed to having to go through the Army Corps of Engineers. In short, does the EPA still stand beside the decision to give the state of Florida primacy with respect to proceeding with 404 permits for the Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act?
I believe that is the case, but let me circle back before I give you a definitive answer on where we are with that process.
You believe you're still with us, or you're not? I want to make sure I get it clear.
Yeah, I believe we are still following what the court has told us we should do, which I know there was a court ruling, and I know there was some consternation there. So let me circle back with you to see exactly where we are on that case.
Okay. The reason why I bring it up, and it's important for our state, since we've taken over that process from the Army Corps, permit applications have, in terms of time, have decreased from roughly around 2 years to 6 months. Obviously, the Sunshine State is, if not the fastest growing state in the country, one of the fastest growing states in the country for a myriad of reasons. So our ability to process these permits, where yes, we do have a lot of waterways that are critical to the ecosystem of Florida, and we take that very seriously in my state. But I think it's important that whether it's Florida or any other state that has that flexibility, that you do have state administrators and state personnel with respect to environmental protection who do take this incredibly seriously, and being able to partner with EPA in order to be able to still process these applications that are important for our economy as well as our environment. That's something critical for us going forward. I hope that the EPA agrees with that.
Absolutely, and as a former state regulator, I definitely understand the importance of the delegated authority, and I believe how we got to this situation where there were some concerns about the administration of the program. And I don't know if we resolved those or not, but I think the court has spoken on that, and so I'll circle back with you to see where we are on that.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. I want to switch gears. Obviously, the EPA came out with the Clean Power Plan 2.0. My concerns are with a couple of things, but primarily 60% of all electricity generation in the United States comes from coal and natural gas. Under the EPA's Clean Power Plan 2.0, essentially coal will be regulated out of existence, and there will be additional burdens put on new natural gas plants that may or may not come online in the United States. Considering your previous statements about wanting to make sure in this hearing that nobody in our country is left behind when it comes to having a clean environment and a clean water, clean air, et cetera, for our citizens, isn't it also a concern that if that plan goes into effect and the power generation that we typically use right now would go away, that electricity prices would skyrocket on poor families, whether they may be black families, Hispanic families, white families, that their costs would go up exorbitantly under that same plan? Wouldn't they be left behind by the Clean Power Plan?
Well, we spent a lot of time with the industry, with the grid operators, and here are the facts from our vantage point. Number one, these control technologies don't have to be put in until 2020, 2031, 2032, so we're talking about some time down the road. Number two, all of our cost estimates say that the actions we're taking will only potentially increase price by less than 1%. And number three, that the approach we're taking, because of the diligence that we've done, will not have any impact on reliability. To the point we were just discussing, this national rule is delegated to the states, and each state will design a state implementation plan that gives it flexibility on how it reaches these goals.
Administrator, I got to cut you down because we've got 20 seconds,
sure.
Congressional hearings. I'm going to respond with this. Whenever we get information from experts who say that costs will be contained in a certain strata, that typically is not the case. Even with the tax credits with the Inflation Reduction Act, CBO said it would cost around $260 billion. Wall Street is saying the value of those credits is upwards of $1.3 trillion and higher. So when you say that essentially regulating out coal and some aspects of natural gas in the United States will only lead to a 1% increase in electricity costs, that simply does not add up. And at the end of the day, whether it's 2024 or 2032, it is poor people in this country who are going to be left behind by that type of proposal. Chairman, I'm over my time. I yield back.
This is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Pollock, it's good to see you. Let's cover a lot of different areas of ground. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, since President Biden took office, the price of goods has continued to outpace family incomes, with prices increasing now 19.3%, while average weekly earnings have only increased 14.6%. So families have fallen behind with respect to their purchasing power that they're able to go and acquire goods. What role has government spending played in creating this untenable economic crisis?
Close that door, please. Sorry, I can't hear very well when the door's open.
So I'll repeat, that's fine.
No, I heard you.
Oh, okay.
That needs to be closed. So what role is government spending as part of the story? So government spent, we had our rates really low. The pandemic happened and we closed the economy and then reopened it. And I think you saw a burst of inflation, everywhere in the world. And certainly there were many contributors to that.
Do you think that the president in his budget calling for an increase of federal spending, up to upwards of 5% increase in federal spending across the board, do you think that's going to have further implications on stubborn inflation plaguing the pocketbooks of the American people?
It would be inappropriate for me to comment on the president's budget.
The only reason why I would ask Mr. Powell is because obviously the Federal Reserve is having to respond to various aspects of fiscal policy coming from Capitol Hill. Regardless of the president's budget, would it be appropriate in the current environment for federal spending to increase 5%, 10%, 15%?
Honestly, that's a question for elected representatives. We don't play a role in fiscal policy.
Fair enough. Is it the view of yourself and the Federal Reserve Board that fiscal policy does create impacts on the Fed's ability to manage monetary policy for the United States?
We take fiscal policy as a given, and we're not commentators, we're not the Congressional Budget Office or the Office of Management Budget. Whatever fiscal policy happens up here, we decline all opportunities to be commentators on it. We take it as a given, and that's because we didn't run for office. We don't have that job. We stick to our knitting. And the fact that we're independent really depends on us sticking to what our assignment is, which is to deal with, things with the economy as it is.
I would argue that the fiscal policy of the United States has given you guys a lot more to deal with, and whatever the various burdens that come with it. Unfortunately, you have to tangle with it, but the American consumer is the one that truly has to deal with it. I'm going to move on. The monetary policy report cites a pickup in immigration as one of the major factors that has improved the supply of labor. However, labor force participation rate remains below pre-pandemic levels. What percentage of the increased foreign-born labor supply, to your knowledge, comes from illegal immigration?
What percentage say it again, the question?
What percentage of foreign-born labor comes from illegal immigration?
I think all of foreign-born labor comes from immigration.
No, illegal immigration.
Illegal.
Illegal,
Sorry,
sir.
didn't get that.
Yes, sir.
I don't know the answer to that.
All right, well, one of the things that I think will be important to help, I guess, advise Congress on what to do going forward is if the Federal Reserve had some data to that regard to help us make further decisions into the future. Chairman Powell, let me ask you this one overarching question. Obviously, interest rates, if you compare it over the last 15 years of monetary policy, is at an elevated rate. Does the Fed anticipate any possibility of rates being lowered, whether it's 50 basis points, 100 basis points, at some point over the next year or two?
So I guess the question really is where are interest rates going to settle out when all of the effects of the pandemic are really done? And no one knows. This is a great discussion to have, but I think my sense, and pretty commonly people think we probably won't go back to that era between the global financial crisis and the pandemic, where rates were very, very low and inflation was very low, and like extremely low. There were major European countries that had negative 10-year bond rates, negative, and that was not the case here. But I don't think we're going back to rates that are that low. We think that things like the neutral rate are driven by slow-moving forces, but ultimately you can see the effect. We have, our policy rate is over 5% now, and it feels like policy is restrictive, but not, intensely restrictive. So that suggests that the neutral rate of interest, at least as of now, will have risen somewhat, which means rates will be a little higher.
Okay, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. We now.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, real quick, at what time was Secret Service aware of the active threat against President Trump? Director, what time?
So the Secret Service was aware that there was an individual who had been identified as suspicious, and that individual was attempting to be tracked down.
At what time?
I don't have a specific timeline other than to tell
Director,
you,
it's been 9 days.
I understand
At what
that.
time?
I want to make sure that I give you factual information, sir.
Director, have you talked to the agents on the ground that day?
Yes, I have.
You've talked to all of them?
Mm-hmm.
Your senior team has talked to every agent that was on the ground that day?
Yes, we have.
Have they all corroborated the same time they identified the shooter or they were made aware of the shooter, either by attendees in the crowd or local police department?
There are a number of reports of when those times were made.
Was it
those
5 minutes
notifications.
before the first shot rang out?
No.
Generally speaking, was it 10 minutes before the first shot rang out?
No. It
Was it 15 minutes before the first shot rang out?
It was less than that time frame when it was identified as a threat.
How many days before the shooting took place did Secret Service actually do their advance work to secure the facility that the rally was going to be held at?
5 days.
In the 5 days prior, when the security advance team did their work, did they identify the rooftop as a potential threat?
Again, I'm pulling those reports and that information.
It's been 9
to
days,
conduct those
Madam
interviews.
Director. Did they notice a rooftop 150 yards away that was a potential threat, yes or no?
I am certain that the rooftop was noticed. I am pulling the reports.
What was the security parameters around securing that rooftop? What did they do?
There was overwatch provided for that rooftop.
Did Overwatch fail?
I am waiting to hear what the results of the investigation were so that I can identify where the failure was.
Who did you talk to that was on the ground that day that was responsible for Overwatch? What are their names?
I'm not going to provide their names in this setting.
Did you talk to the people that were providing Overwatch that day?
I've talked to the people that conducted the advance on that day and that were working the shift and were the counter snipers on that day.
So you talked to the counter sniper team, you talked to the people who were providing Overwatch that day, and you talked to the advance team, correct?
Yes, sir.
What did they tell you?
We are putting together a comprehensive report so that I can identify exactly where the gaps and the failures.
When the counter sniper team was on the roof and they identified that there was suspicious activity on the roof in question, what was the chain of command's orders around the person on said roof? Because I'm quite sure somebody saw under your organization, the Secret Service, I'm quite sure somebody saw the shooter on the roof. So what was the communication through the chain of command to deal with said person?
What I can tell you is that when the individual was identified by the counter sniper, they took one shot and neutralized that individual.
But that was after the shooter already took a shot, is that correct?
That is correct.
So what you're saying now is that the Secret Service did not see the shooter on the roof until after the shooter took a shot?
I do not have all of those details at this time.
If you don't have those details after 9 days, Director, then what you're telling me is that you guys didn't see it. Is that correct?
I am telling you I don't have all the details of the sequence at this time.
Director, it's been 9 days. Either you have the information or you do not. Is that correct?
We are still in the process of conducting interviews and an investigation.
Some of my colleagues have texted me over the last couple days, bipartisan, about whether you should lose your job, and I've been quiet on that question because I wanted to see what you were going to do today. In my opinion, you do need to be fired immediately, and it is because this is gross incompetence. And the fact that it's been 9 days, and these are simple questions to answer, I'm quite sure if I asked any one of my kids if they got in trouble and I told them to give me the details, I would get more answers from them than I'm getting from you right now. And that's what's frustrating on a bipartisan basis, on a nonpartisan basis. This is a joke. And Director, you're in charge, and that's why you need to go. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Goldman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I want to follow up and just understand a little bit why there.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner Ueda, in October of 2021, the special purpose acquisition company Digital World Acquisition Corporation announced plans to merge with former President Trump's newly formed media company, Trump Media and Technology Group. The SEC then brought its first ever enforcement action against a special purpose acquisition company using a novel legal theory, coincidentally a month later, after Senator Warren urged the SEC to investigate the merger. It's also worth noting that in addition to Chairman Gensler's role as CFO of the then Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, the former head of enforcement at the SEC was married to Peter Strzok, the current director of enforcement, repeatedly targeted the Trump administration as Attorney General of New Jersey, and the current general counsel at the SEC, Ms. Megan Barbero, litigated both impeachments against President Trump from former Speaker Pelosi. This seems yet another instance of the Biden-Harris's administration of lawfare against former President Trump. Commissioner Ueda, according to the SEC public records, you voted against the July 2023 settlement agreement between the SEC and Digital World Acquisition Corp., which fined DWAC for $18 million. Can you elaborate on your decision to vote against the settlement agreement?
I was particularly concerned and had problems with the penalty that was being imposed. The way the penalty was structured, the only time the penalty would be imposed is if the SPAC went through with the merger with Trump Media. In other words, the very people who we claim to be protecting, the investors in that entity, would be the ones who would have to foot the bill and pay that civil penalty. And for that reason, I had strong objections to the settlement.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Commissioner Peirce, as a regulatory sandbox advocate, if you listen to these hearings enough, I think that's where we should be moving a lot of our regulatory environment into a sandbox model. How would a digital asset sandbox function within the language of the Fit for the 21st Century Act?
I mean, I think what it would allow is for people to come in on a small scale and try things. And so they'll come in and register that you've heard from the SEC a lot could be brought to life because people could actually come in, say, these are the conditions that we're going to comply with, and they could go out and try something. They wouldn't have to wait to get through an SEC approval process that never finishes.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Thank you for that. Commissioner Crenshaw, in 2021, you published a statement where you emphasized the need for the DeFi industry and the SEC to collaborate to bring DeFi into the regulatory perimeter in a way that balances innovation and with investor protection. Would you characterize the SEC's current approach to DeFi as collaborative thus far?
Well, thank you. I think there's been a lot of rhetoric on both sides. But what I would really like to see is getting down to brass tacks and a practical application. And I have asked for folks to bring in pen to paper where you're finding challenges. They know their industry and their business model better than we ever can. And so what I would really like to see is pen to paper where you're having challenges. And with that, I think staff would be for it, and I certainly know that my office would look at it and look to see how we can move forward. And I think we could. I think there's a lot of flexibility under the existing regime where there are ways to move forward.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ueda, I want to go back to you because I know what you said earlier. You thought that the settlement was frankly unfair to the investors that the SEC is somewhat charged with protecting. Did you find that this entire process to move towards a settlement was outside the norm of the SEC's operations in previous years? And what I mean by that, and let me clarify, what I mean by that is, would the SEC engage in the same type of novel theory if it was dealing with any other enterprise that did not include former President Trump?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, hold on to that.
Absolutely.
Mr. Glenser?
Absolutely. It was following the facts and the law, and there was disclosure violations, and we worked through those with the company, Digital World Acquisition Company, and had a resolution of it, a settlement.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired.